All right, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Tone Theory live stream series I've been doing here on the channel the past couple of weeks. Today we're talking about the difference between gain and master volume in terms of guitar amps. We're going to cover a couple of different topics, and I'm going to show you how I like to dial in an amp like this. This is the Hiwatt Custom 20, but we're going to get into the signal flow in just a second. Quick announcement before we get started. I just released my first impulse response pack. An IR pack is now available. I spent the last 2.5 weeks working on this, and I'm actually going to be running the IRs today through the Torpedo Captor X. The IR you're going to be hearing is two different files from my divided by 13 cabinet of Royer 121 and a 57. So those are available in the description box down below. They work on Helix, Kemper, Axe Effects, any IR loader. I've tested them with pretty much everything out there. So those are now available, and we're running a sale, 15% off everything in my store, including the new IR packs and the tone course. So if you use the code RS504 at checkout, you can get 15% off. All right, so let's talk about gain versus volume in terms of guitar amps. What's the difference? And why is it important to know? So quickly, signal chain today, running the Fender Ventera Tele, the Tele Deluxe here. This thing is awesome. It's completely stock as it came out of the box. It hasn't even had a setup. So Fender Tele, going through my pedal board, my Vertex built pedal board on the floor right now, but everything is off. It's literally just running through the volume pedal right now, and then going into the Hiwatt Custom 20. So the Hiwatt, this is a 20 watt EL, I think it's 84s in the power section of this, but I chose this amp because it has a master volume and a gain control, as well as a 3-band EQ, and it's got a high and low input. So it's actually a really, really versatile amp. I love this thing. And I should point out that the idea for this lesson came from, I was on the phone earlier today with Rick Beato, and we were talking about amps, and he was like, man, you should talk about the difference between master volume and gain. And I thought it was a really good idea. So shout out to Rick. Then from the Hiwatt, we're going into the Torpedo Captor X from 2 notes, and then straight into Logic via preamps and all kinds of outboard gear. So this is my tone as it's set right now. Kind of edge of breakup. So, all right, what's the difference between master volume and gain? This was explained to me years ago, and it's sort of stuck with me as sort of the best way to think about it. Gain is sort of like your volume control going into an amplifier or a recording preamp or into a DAW. Your gain is controlling how much signal you're sending into that device. In this case, our device is a guitar amplifier. So the amount of gain is controlling the amount of guitar signal that we're sending into the preamp section, through the tone stack, through the power amp section, through the output transformer, and then into the guitar cabinet. So most of you are probably familiar with this concept. If I start to play and push the gain control, I'm going to get more distortion, but I'm really primarily only getting preamp distortion here. I'm not distorting the power amp. Volume, which in this case on this amp is labeled master for master volume, is essentially controlling the output of whatever device you happen to be going through. In this case, a guitar amplifier. So the volume is controlling how loud the amp is in the room. Now, because I'm running DI, I can pretty much set my master volume wherever. But if I was actually on a gig or in a recording session, I have to balance my preamp, my gain, and my master volume to get the tone that I want at the level that I need to be at, especially when you're playing live. That's really important. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute, like how to balance these two controls to get the right volume and the right tone. So gain is the amount of signal on the way in. Volume is the amount of signal on the way out. I should point out that reverb that you're hearing is coming from the Captor X. It's not from a pedal. I've got a plate reverb pulled up in that. So like I said a second ago, if you're gonna push the gain, you want to be careful about where you're sending your volume. Okay, so let's say right now I was on a session and I needed to dial up a signal. I wanted a good rhythm sound, right? Like a good, good driving rhythm sound. Let's say I wanted it a little bit more gritty, a little dirtier than that. Well, my first instinct might be to go to push this gain control up. That sounds pretty good. But again, I'm primarily overdriving the preamp section, the preamp tubes themselves. Okay, so this is the next thing we're going to talk about. What's the difference between preamp distortion and power amp distortion? It's different for each amp. It's different based on the amp's circuitry and topology in terms of what type of power tubes does it have, what type of preamp section does it have, what type of tone stack does it have. Typically, preamp distortion, I'm going to switch to amp view here. Preamp distortion is going to be, depending on the amp, a little bit more gainy, a little bit more mid-range, again, depending on the circuit, the type of preamp tubes. And it can get a little muddy. So if you listen to this, I'm just going to dime the preamp section here, and you should hear what I'm talking about. Doesn't sound bad, but to me, that tone isn't what I have in my head when I think cranked amp. Cranked Hiwatt, cranked Marshall tone. That's a little too bitey in the top end and a little too mid-rangey. And a big part of that is because I'm driving the preamp section. I'm driving the preamp tubes. Now listen to what happens. Because this is a 20-watt amp, it actually doesn't have a ton of headroom. So I can pretty easily introduce power amp distortion just by diming the master volume control here. So essentially what I'm doing is the same thing, but I'm sending more signal through the power amp section, through the power tubes than the preamp tubes, and they start to clip and they start to distort. But it's going to be a different feel. So I'm going to crank the master volume here, bring the gain back down a little bit, and that's got more low mid response. It's a little more punchy and it's not as harsh. The other thing is, if I was running through an actual cabinet, which because I'm live streaming right now, it's not really feasible. But if I was in a room running through an actual cabinet, depending on what speakers I have in that cabinet and how efficient they are, I'm going to start to introduce speaker distortion. I'm going to start pushing the speakers to where they start to break up, which is part of that sound. When you think about like a cranked Marshall, a cranked plexi sound, that's more than just the preamp section or just the power amp section distorting. It's a culmination of everything. It's the preamp section cascading into the power amp section distorting, and then pushing a 412 speaker cabinet where the speakers are also breaking up a little bit. You're also moving air when you're pushing through a cabinet, which is it's part of that sound. If you've ever been in the room with an amp that is dimed, a 50-watt amp or maybe a 100-watt amp, there's this concussion that happens, this thing that like hits you in the chest. It's kind of hard to describe, but great amps, great powerful guitar amps all have that thing where as soon as you hit the note, there's this thud in your chest, and it's amazing. It's intoxicating. I love it. Obviously, we're not going to get that today because I'm playing direct through the internet, but you should notice that the power amp distorts differently than the preamp does. And oftentimes, if you can blend the two, so I'm going to bring the preamp gain up and the power amp gain up, we're going to get, this to me is the sweet spot of this amp. If you're really looking to drive this amp, this really is the spot. Keep in mind, there's no pedals. We're not boosting it. We're not hitting it with any overdrive. This is full-on tube distortion, soft clipping overdrive. That sounds killer. So that's kind of the difference between preamp distortion and power amp distortion. Again, it's completely dependent on your amp and what you're running. Fender amps, for example, like if you take a twin reverb, for example, twins are known for being clean amps. They don't really break up. I have an amp that's kind of like that up here on the rack, the Port City Pearl that's behind me. That is a clean amp that does not distort, and it's designed not to distort because you want to use that as what we would call a pedal platform amp. So you can introduce gain and distortion through pedals rather than actually driving the amp itself. The trade-off is you have an amp with a pedal platform amp like a Pearl or a twin reverb, for example, that can sometimes lack some character. It's essentially just amplifying whatever you're giving it. Phil, I see in the top chat, man, you have no master volume on your deluxe reverb. Use a Hiwatt Power Station 2 so you can achieve breakup and loop some effects. Are you getting preamp, post amp, or both when the deluxe is on 7 and attenuated? That's a really good question. So with an amp that doesn't have a master volume like a deluxe reverb, yes, you are driving the preamp section and the power amp section. You just have one knob, a volume knob. Now look, I don't design and build amps. I know, we're not going to get into the different types of master volumes like post-phase inverter master volume and all this different stuff. Really what we're trying to do here is explain the differences in how to dial in your amp at home or on a gig to get the right sound. So yes, in a deluxe reverb or an amp that just has a power knob, or a volume knob, I'm sorry, like my Morgan AC20 Deluxe back there, essentially just has a volume knob, and it has a power scaling feature which will allow me to turn the output wattage of the amp down. But essentially, when I'm driving the amp harder, I'm driving the preamp section and power amp section together. And you can do the same thing. Like, let's say I wanted to have a loud edge of breakup tone with this Hiwatt. So let's say I was on a gig and we were playing a big stage, and I had room, I had space on stage to really push this 20-watt amp, but I don't want to always run it super distorted, right? I don't always want this level of gain. There are parts in the set where I'm playing clean, or maybe I'm playing some long trail reverbs and stuff that I don't want to distort. There's a couple of different ways that you can get loud edge of breakup tones. With an amp like this, the first thing I would do is push the master volume, not all the way, because again, this is a 20-watt amp. It doesn't have a ton of headroom. So I'm going to push the master volume to maybe about 1 or 2 o'clock here on the dial. And then I'm going to bring the gain control, that preamp gain control, all the way down. So I'm going to start to play and slowly roll that gain up. And find that point where it really starts to break up, which is about there. And now I have I've got good edge of breakup, high volume tone. Now, why would you want to do this? Like I said earlier, the more air you can move, the more you can make those speakers work, and you can make that cabinet resonate and move, generally, the better tone you're going to have, the quote-unquote better tone you're going to have. I like to try and keep my amp as loud as I can feasibly get away with it. Sometimes that's not very loud at all. But again, if you're on a big stage, or if you're recording at home, or you are recording in a studio and you can push your amp I always like to push as much volume through the cabinet as the speakers can handle and the microphones that you might be recording with can handle. So that bass out of there, add some more treble. So to me, that's a really good edge of breakup tone, where I can dig in with my guitar and I can get some distortion. Then I can lighten up and it cleans up. The other thing you can do too, let's say I was running the amp a little hotter and it didn't quite clean up as much as I wanted to. Use your volume knob, man. Roll the volume off on the guitar. That's another control you have over this whole signal path. It's another volume control. You're controlling the output of your guitar signal going into, so you're feeding less signal into the preamp section, effectively having a similar result as turning the preamp gain control down, right? You just have it on your guitar. Joe Bonamassa is incredible with this. I remember watching an interview with him years ago where he talked about how most guitar players he knows of, they don't ever touch their volume and tone controls on their guitar. And I was like that for a long time. I would never touch the volume. I just leave everything at 10 all the time and either turn on a pedal for more gain or go over to the amp and adjust something. When realistically, you have a ton of control right here on your guitar. You should be using it. So if this was my tone, then maybe the next song is a little bit softer and sweeter, I might roll the volume off to get that. You notice there, I haven't touched any pedals. I haven't touched the amp. It's all in how I'm playing, how hard I'm playing the guitar, what type of dynamics I'm using to play, and my volume controls. So if you're not doing that, you should be experimenting with it at home, using your volume knob on your guitar. But let's say, for example, right now I'm running the amp really loud and edge of breakup tones. Let's say I rolled up to a small club or a bar and I can't play that loud at all. Well, I can still achieve the same type of tone. I can still get that edge of breakup, really juicy, gritty tone at a lower volume when you have a master volume amp like this. This is a little bit tougher to do with an amp like a deluxe reverb, like Phil was talking about earlier, because you only have the singular volume control. So at that point, then yeah, you would have to introduce something like an attenuator or a load box or some outboard piece of equipment to attenuate the output signal of the amp. But if your amp has a master volume and a gain control, this is all you really need. We have to strike that balance though. So let's say I rolled up to, the next night on tour. Last night we were in a huge theater. We played to 5,000 people and I had a big stage and I could, crank the amp and get the tone. And then tonight we're in a new market. We're in a city we've never played before and we're playing to a 300 cap room and it's a much smaller stage. Well, the settings that I have on my amp from last night probably aren't going to work. So I need to dial in the amp for the room, right? So the first thing, obviously, that I'm going to do is roll the master volume down. And you really have to be in the room at this point to find where that sweet spot is. Where is it going to live? Let's just say, for this example, it's right there. It's like 11 o'clock. Now you can tell that the character of the amp has completely changed. It doesn't sound at all like it did a second ago. That's because I'm not pushing as much signal through the power amp as I was before. So again, here's some power amp distortion. And now here is little to no power amp distortion. But let's say I wanted that edge of breakup tone. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is probably switch to my low input because this amp has it. This is going to push less signal through the preamp section. Which is effectively going to give me more headroom, which means the amp's not going to break up as soon. So that's a good, clean-ish tone. There's a little bit of distortion on that. But I want that edge of breakup tone. So let's switch back to the high input. And so now I'm going to push the preamp section and try and introduce my gain there. And then it's a matter of dialing in the master volume, the output volume to the room. And it's this balancing act, right? Because at this point, if let's say, okay, the amp is a little quiet, we're sound checking, the band is coming in, I'm like, oh, actually, you know what? I can push a little bit more, right? We're playing, so I'm going to come over here and push the master volume up a little bit. Sorry, my headstock's hiding it. Now, that's interacting differently with the preamp gain, right? I'm pushing a little too much gain now. I'm no longer in edge of breakup territory. I'm fully broken up. So now I'm going to come over and dial the preamp gain back a little bit to maintain that edge of breakup tone right there that I'm looking for. Sounds pretty good to me. And at that point, you know, depending on how the show's going, most gigs I've played, as the night goes on, the band gets louder and louder, and, you know, I start to push it more and more. But these concepts work whether you're playing in churches or at home, in your bedroom, or recording for yourself or recording remotely for other people. It's about finding that balance of the tone. Now, again, with something like this load box up here, volume is not an issue because I'm going direct, right? Like if I take my ear out, I can't, you know, this amp's not making any noise in the room. So at this point, it's really more about dialing in the tone you want and finding the right amount of headroom. So we'll end with talking about how these settings interact with a couple of different pedals. I've got my pedal board on the floor back here, and I'm going to put a boost through. I'm going to use the Mjolnir from Mythos pedals, which is kind of a clone. Now, in my opinion, a lot of amps have sort of a threshold in terms of gain, where the more gain you introduce past that threshold, it starts to sound worse and worse and worse, right? Like this amp, for example, it's 20 watt, EL84 powered. This is not a great amp if you are playing a 7 or an 8 string and looking to gent, right? It's not designed for that. It doesn't have that type of EQ. It doesn't have that tightness in the bottom end that those guys are looking for. If I were to just dime the preamp, the master, and hit it with a pedal, the Mjolnir, you're going to hear this amp really starts to fall apart. To me, that sounds terrible. It's not because it's high gain. I like high gain. It's just it doesn't hold together. There's not the definition there. There's not the dynamic response there. The amp just really starts to fall apart. And it makes sense because you're really overloading the preamp section and you're overloading the power amp section at the same time. So I think if you're at home, if you're a home player, it's about finding the sweet spot of the amplifier. Now, I've recorded and I've played this amp a lot, and I know that if I'm going to hit it with a boost pedal, here's the Mjolnir again. I'm going to hit it with a boost pedal. I like to live somewhere right about here. So master is around between 11 o'clock and 1, and gain, same thing, somewhere around 11 o'clock and 1. And again, remember, because I'm going direct, it doesn't matter where my master volume is at in terms of output volume, because there is no output volume here in the room. I'm not worried about my neighbors. I'm not, pushing volume in a small club. It's really more about how much power amp distortion do I want to introduce into my overall tone. So let's say I was going to dial in a really cool lead sound here with this telly. And I was at home and I was practicing and I wanted to play right, let's say I wanted to dial in a good lead sound with that. Well, right now that's sounding a little saturated. It's getting away from me a little bit. A reminder, I've got the Mjolnir on, so I am boosting the front end. I'm not introducing any gain with the Mjolnir. I'm just hitting the front end of the amp harder. It's boosting the preamp. So I'm sending more signal into the preamp section than I was before. That's essentially the definition of a boost. You're boosting that signal, and you're causing the preamp section and the power amp section to clip and distort. So let's say I wanted a really good lead sound. I'm probably going to bring the preamp gain down a little bit because I know that the character of that gain control in this particular amp, when the preamp breaks up, it adds a little more brightness. It adds some top-end brilliance. And because I'm playing a telly with a maple neck, I've already got plenty of top end. I've got plenty of brightness coming in. Let me get back into frame here. I got plenty of brightness coming from the guitar itself. So I don't really need any more brightness from the amp. You can see I got the treble rolled pretty far back here as well. So I want more mid-range. I want more mid-range punch to kind of compensate for this telly bridge pickup and the maple neck that I've got here. And so on this particular amp, I know pushing the power amp section is going to give me a little bit more of that mid-range. That mid-range sort of thud that I'm looking for. Right, there it is. And you can also hear some ghosting in here. Check this out. Because I'm really pushing the output of this amp, you're hearing some ghosting. Now, ghosting is an effect when you're pushing an amp hard. You really have to be pushing an amp to hear it. You're actually getting the 60 cycle hum sine wave from the wall, from the power, sort of filtering its way through into the output signal. So if you listen, when I bend this note, you're going to hear very subtle, and you might not be able to hear it if you're on a laptop or a phone, but if you're listening on good speakers or you have headphones in, when I bend this note, there's like a very slight undertone happening under all of it. And some pedals, like the Revival Drive from Origin Effects, actually emulate this ghosting effect. That's kind of one of the big things that separates the Revival Drive from other preamp overdrives, is they give you control over that ghosting effect. But with the Mjolnir, I'm actually really happy with the way this sounds. I think this would be a great That's a good, like, chunky, saturated lead sound right there. If I'd go into the low input with the boost, now we're getting a little bit into, like, get a little... Hold on. There we go. That's what I wanted. Now I'm going to roll the volume off on this neck pickup a little bit. Yeah, that sounds good. So, there you go, everyone. That's the difference between gain and volume. Hope you enjoyed today's Tone Theory live stream. Let me know in the comments, either live or if you're rewatching this later, let me know what you want to see next on this Tone Theory series. I'm having a lot of fun doing these, actually. Don't forget 15% off everything in my store, including the brand new impulse responses that I just dropped. Those are available in the link in the description box down below, as well as the live chat. And that 15% off includes the tone course. So the tone course takes these concepts and goes more in depth into them. So yeah, if you haven't checked that out yet, please do so. And checking out the chat here. Awesome. Maybe next week we'll talk about delay or reverb. So many topics to cover. All right, everyone. See you on the next one.